Welcome, everyone, to Virtue's brand of wrestling right here on BigVito.com and the Big Vito brand. I am Virtue, and I want to discuss some wrestling with you today. But before then, I want to plug an indie show that I'm going to be at very soon, and it's going to be on Saturday, November 24th, just a couple days after Thanksgiving. Go to my Twitter at NoDQ_Virtue. You can go to my Facebook page, nodq.com/virtue with the lowercase v, and you will see information about it there. I am actually in a match against Razor Sharp, but I will have my army at ringside, and I'm a pretty good politician, so we'll see exactly what happens. But nonetheless, if you live near Cleveland, Ohio, you want to check it out, UXWA. But again, go to my social media. You will be able to get more information about that. That is Saturday, November 24th, 2 days after Thanksgiving. So what I want to talk about today, here's a teaser for movie or movies of the week. And I want to talk about polarizing figures in the history of the wrestling business, and the fact that if you have opinions either pro or con against these guys, and some of them are considered con men of the wrestling business, a certain group of fans or people will really go out of their way to try to belittle you or discredit you. Heck, they'll even unfollow you on Twitter, even if you've read their columns for 20 years. So nonetheless, let's start with Jim Cornette. I'm a Jim Cornette fan. The second guy that I'm going to talk about is Eric Bischoff. I'm not an Eric Bischoff fan. On-screen character, absolutely. With Jim Cornette, I liked his on-screen character and his old school mentality that wrestling is a sport and the way that he books. I'm a fan of that. So for Jim, I like both sides of the coin. Eric, I kind of despise his business acumen, so to speak. And again, we'll talk about that. But he was an excellent heel on-screen character. So for that, Eric Bischoff, you made waves in the wrestling business. And then, of course, Vince Russo. I am a creative guy at heart, and creative writer. That's not what I do for my shoot job. I'm a math guy. So go figure, right? You're only supposed to have one side of your brain. Or, you're either all math or you're either all creative and art. Well, I share both. But I chose to do the math side as my shoot job because I'm good at that and it's consistent. Whereas my creative side, I would have had to go out to LA, Vegas, Hollywood. Working for wrestling companies, right? I mean, it's not a secure. They're not secure gigs. They're who do you know? And so what I do on the side with doing these videos for different websites and the Big Vito brand and giving my creativity and thoughts as a fan, that's my fix. Would I have worked for WWE if I had an opportunity to do what Vince Russo did? Absolutely. That would be it. I don't think I would have worked for any smaller company. It'd have to be WWE or bust because you got to make the money, right? It's about doing that, even with the pressures of doing that job. But Vince Russo, I've looked up to him because looking back at what he did, it's not the TV writing that I looked up to for him. A lot of people think, his Attitude Era, right? But he had to work with Ed Ferrara and Vince McMahon, and when he went on his own, he sucked. WCW, TNA, we're going to talk about that. I enjoy Vince Russo's work from the magazines. I remember those WWF magazines, the Raw magazines, and they're with media today and your cell phone, magazines are a lost art, at least good ones. They're still out there. There's still newsstands. But I don't even think WWE doesn't even do a magazine anymore. And just something about seeing them on the shelf at the store, the smell of the new pages was cool. You'd have Sonny and Sable in there, looking at them growing up, right, as a teenager. The stories that Vince Russo created in the magazine, I mean, that got him the writing gig in WWE. That's what Vince wanted, because Vince knew McMahon needed a change. And Cornette's way was, the old school way that wasn't drawing anymore against WCW. And all the parties I'm going to discuss today, Cornette, Bischoff, Russo, were all involved in companies during this time. And it's amazing that Russo was a wrestling fan that got into the business because he's a journalism degree. He's a writer. So he started working for WWE as a writer of the magazine, and then he became an editor of the magazine. And back then, the magazines were cool. The Raw magazine was cool. It was cool enough for WWE to make two magazines, the WWF magazine and the Raw magazine. The Raw one was the edgy one. That's where the Vince Russo creativity came out, and Vince McMahon saw that and made him head writer eventually. That's what I love, right? And I have a buddy of mine that, likes the visual arts type thing of comics and magazines. It's just cool. There's something you look at down the road, after they're old, like comic books, and you look at them and you're like, wow, this is a piece of history. This was creative writing. So how does this all parlay into me being a little upset at the way, if you like or dislike somebody, all of a sudden, you lose credibility? So I went on Twitter the other day and I said, Eric Bischoff is an asshole. That's the absolute truth. Even though it's my opinion, I believe that's the truth. And there's nothing wrong with that. Eric Bischoff being an asshole is why he was able to learn the wrestling business with Vern Gagne and all those people. Ended up getting his gig once in WWF, but ultimately in WCW. And Ted Turner trusted him to run the show. Hey, here's my money. Buy up some wrestlers, make a product. And Bischoff, for 83 weeks, and he's talking about this on podcasts, for 83 weeks, WCW was a superior brand to WWF in ratings on Monday night. But, I mean, in general, it was a superior brand. It was competition, and it forced WWF to actually do something and have to change their ways. Cornette, great on-screen character, but his booking philosophy was old. Now, people like me like those 95 matches, 96 whatever Cornette, and I think Bruce Pritchard, what they were booking. But a lot of mainstream people, casuals who tuned into WCW Nitro because they recognized all the star power from everybody that Bischoff was buying up with Ted Turner's money, they were watching Nitro because they knew the people. They didn't know who these bad gimmicks of the mid-90s in WWF were. And, of course, they still had Shawn and Brett at the time. But there were people undeveloped yet, like Stone Cold and The Rock. They just weren't ready. But the fact is, I called Eric Bischoff an asshole, and it turned into me being, oh, you're such a pro-Russo lover. You don't see, you don't see this bad stuff he did. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm putting over Cornette, right? Because I liked what he did, coming into the business, making wrestling a sport, making it, the old school feel that Cornette brought, right? Rock and Roll Express, Midnight Express, all that good stuff. And how he kind of came into WWF and was a manager. I love manager. Everybody knows that's what I do in the Indies, small time here near Cleveland. To me, it's a lost performing art. Bobby Heenan, Jimmy Hart. I respect Cornette for what he did as an on-screen character and his old school mentality booking. But also, when Cornette lies because he hates Russo so much and they say things about Russo. Now, Bischoff is in on this because they hate Russo. Russo's on record saying that these guys, Cornette and Bischoff, hate him because he literally didn't take their jobs, but boom, in WWF, Russo became Vince McMahon's head writer and went to Vince's living room with McMahon and wrote the shows. Cornette booted from the creative team. In TNA, I'm not sure what happened in WCW. Their paths only crossed briefly, but in TNA, there was some issues there. Again, power struggles, who's more creative. And again, Bischoff's an asshole because in business, that's how you are. That's how you got to be to get your spot at the top. When I say Eric Bischoff is an asshole, it's the truth. That's how he got his gigs. But the problem is, so Cornette, his old school way, I got outdated. And unfortunately, he tried to get back into the on-screen role, just never got a. The problem is he wasn't ever going to change his old school ways. We're talking about Cornette now. So therefore, he never, which would have been cool, managed an Attitude Era team. He wanted to manage his NWA type of teams, and it just wasn't selling at that point. People were like, who are you, Jim Cornette? You're boring. We got DX now. We got the Headbangers and stuff like that. I think Cornette, to become interesting, and of course, he did get booted. Now, he could have stayed with the creative team in WWF maybe if he opened up a little bit. He could have still had his old school mentality, but he could have been like, Russo's way, we need to do something. WCW's beating us. But egos in a business that's volatile, that's the problem. So I see how he kind of faded away. He went to do some OVW stuff later on, Ring of Honor, came back into TNA. But Cornette was his own worst enemy. He didn't want to change. He wanted wrestling to always be a sport. But with time, as time passes, things change. We know that. That's why we had the Attitude Era. Now, I don't know what this era today is called, the wrestling era, but it's not sport. It's Spot Fest wrestling era. It's gymnastics wrestling era. It's crazy. So I like Cornette, what he did booking and what he did as an on-screen character. Especially that, I probably like Cornette's on-screen character the most out of all these guys. And I know Russo played an on-screen character in Bischoff, great assholes on stage. But Cornette was just the magical manager, and I love managers. So, boom, Cornette gets props for that. I don't really know what I hated about Cornette other than I see his old school mentality. He did not adapt, and I think he could have really brought some old school spice and mixed it with attitude, but he just refused to, and he's being stubborn, and he hates Russo, and he hates guys like Kenny Omega and his old – it's kind of funny and amusing and entertaining, but Cornette will never change his ways. So that would be one of his faults. But I don't really know if there's anything I hate about Cornette. Bischoff, again, he's an asshole. He did what he had to do to spend Ted Turner's money, but he paid too many guys top dollars, guaranteed money, to bring them over for their name recognition, and it ultimately led to WCW imploding from within because too many cooks in the kitchen, the inmates running the asylum, because a lot of them had creative control under contract. And for that, Bischoff thought, hey, these wrestlers, I'm still the guy. I'm still in charge, but I'll sign these wrestlers up. They'll be my buddies. As great as Bischoff was to get WCW to win for 83 weeks, I mean, didn't he kind of steal the NWO gimmick from Japan? I just think if Bischoff was truly a visionary, he would have been able to adapt WCW when it was time to change again, like Vince McMahon did WWE, WWF. But what happened is WCW got so big within, it imploded. And, of course, I know the AOL Time Warner merger didn't help things, right? That maybe it was inevitable that wasn't going to work out. But if Bischoff was on his A game, if he was less of an asshole, I think a lot of what you saw on his on-screen character, the jet black hair, the pearly white teeth, the leather jacket, that asshole Eric Bischoff on camera on Nitro that was part of the NWO, that was Eric Bischoff in real life. And that's why those characters are awesome on TV, because the real-life gimmicks are appealing, and I think that's why Bischoff did so well as an on-screen authority figure. I mean, he even was general manager of Raw for a bit in WWE. Remember that time Vince brought him in and they hugged? Crazy. But so Bischoff, to me, from a business standpoint, you built an empire of WCW, and you had something, and you had young talent. You had Jericho, Benoit, Eddie, Booker T, and you fucked it up. Sorry, I don't mean to swear, but you effed it up. And ultimately, that started leading to the demise of WCW. And then Bischoff gets all the heat for WCW going under. Well, or not Bischoff, Russo, when he comes in, when he leaves WWE because he was burnt out because SmackDown was now on his plate, him and Ed Ferrara leave WWE. And they start writing for WCW. And that first 3-month stint, ratings went up because, see, before Russo even left WWE, WWE was already beating WCW in the ratings. Russo left, and I'm sure he thought that he was going to get WCW back even or above WWF, right? I'm sure Russo had an ego there. Good payday from WCW. Why not? You didn't have to write 2 shows, or well, they did have Thunder, but I'm sure it just seemed a lot easier because the stress of working with McMahon, I'm sure, was a lot higher. But Russo, ratings slightly went up, but then he got booted for whatever reason. And then he came back, the ratings went back down. And then when he came back and had that 6-month run, and I believe he came back with Bischoff, ratings slightly went up again. But as he said, WCW at that point was already so far gone, there was no saving it. So, of course, near the tail end of that 6-second run of Russo writing WCW, the ratings slowly started falling down again. Now, of course, you're in the hottest era of wrestling with WWE in the Attitude Era. Vince McMahon, right, who's built the big WWE empire. How do you top that? How do you top the Attitude Era and those high rating segments with The Rock and all this and that, Stone Cold, with those talents and how over and hot they got? You can't. So everything he did after WWE, you got to realize that was just the perfect scenario. But he did not fail. Going to Russo going to WCW, and if the ratings would have flatlined or went in the tank from what they were the prior months to him coming there, especially the first 3-month run, that would have been a failure. The fact that he went home and they brought him back again, and that's when we started getting greed and new blood and all that stuff. Again, if it would have went boom completely down, that would have been failure. But he sustained. I think Russo had TNA up to 1.5 to 2 million people at one point. But oh no, look at TNA's number. Again, everybody wants to try to look at numbers, and if they don't like somebody like Russo, they're going to only point out any low numbers around the time, but they'll ignore anything good, positive trends, or even if ratings were slightly up, they'll ignore anything good if they don't like somebody. If I don't like Bischoff, I don't ignore the fact that he had Nitro beating Raw in the ratings for 83 weeks. That happened. That's the truth. Just because I said he's an asshole, I'm not just going to discredit that. Just because Jim Cornette never adapted into modern day wrestling and he wanted everything old school, sports style, I'm not going to discredit Jim for everything that he did. That is the problem with these polarizing figures in wrestling. It's just, especially fans today, with the internet, with dirt sheets. When I see like Brian Alvarez and Dave Meltzer totally crap on Vince Russo, shame on you. He contributed to the wrestling business, and you're trying to discredit that. He was the editor for the WWF and Raw magazines. If he never became a head writer, you give him credit for that. That's more journalism in the actual business than your dirt sheets are. I don't know, and if you hate Cornette because you think he's just obnoxious and he hates today's wrestling product of the flipper and flyers, I don't like that style match. I like the old school psychology stuff like Cornette preaches, but I still kind of respect what Okada and Omega do. So I'm not going to go to the extreme of Cornette and say today's product's complete crap. Joey Ryan's penis gimmick sucks. I get it. People are trying to entertain. These wrestlers today are trying to entertain. So there's aspects of all of these polarizing figures that I like. Why don't I bring Vince McMahon into this topic? Well, I can't say he's polarizing. Yeah, half the people love Vince McMahon and half the people don't love him. But and that's only when he pushes the people that they don't like. But in reality, I think in general, the wrestling community, if Vince McMahon passes away, 90% of them are going to agree because they loved Vince and everything he did for wrestling. So that's why, to me, Vince isn't polarizing, even though you could say he is with the half the people like him, kiss ass Vince McMahon, yes, man, and half the people don't. So that's why I won't put Vince in this category. You know, Paul Heyman, he did the ECW underground thing, cult following. Paul Heyman's beloved. He's not polarizing. But I think Cornette has an equal amount of haters that he does supporters. Bischoff's the same way. Russo's the same way. These are the three guys in wrestling that just have that, you either love them or you hate them. And if you hate them, to you, he did nothing good, or they did nothing good. If you love them, you're going to only really praise the good things that they did. You might, you know, sweep under the rug some of the things they didn't. But again, let's look at all three of these. What did Bischoff really do that was bad? Maybe he overspent on too many egos and gave too many people creative control, right? That'd be that. But other than that, he didn't do anything bad. Cornette didn't adapt to modern day wrestling, or how wrestling was evolving with the Attitude Era. He didn't want to adapt. But does that make him bad? Russo wanted to go do stuff on his own and be that creative guy. And people say with no filters, but be that creative guy against the powerhouse that he helped build with Vince McMahon to get the WWE Attitude Era up to the top of the wrestling business again. He wanted to go compete against that. That's where maybe Russo was at fault. You had something so great, but again, maybe he was, like he said, Russo was burned out, writing 2 shows. Maybe he saw Stephanie getting too much power and Shane. Maybe he's like, oh, this is going to become a family affair. Well, who knows where this, he had his reasons, right? He claims his family. He wanted to spend more time with his family and working with Vince. That just wasn't an option. And again, WCW made him a nice offer. But when you're a creative person, you throw things on against the wall. You might throw 100 if only 10 of them stick. The 10 things could be great. Should those be discredited because you threw 90 pieces of crap against the wall too with them? No. It's like fishing in the gold mine back there in the gold rush, going through the river. You're going to get a lot of dirt and rocks, but there's gold in that river. And Russo was great with that. I mean, come on. The things that he wrote, clearly, Vince McMahon okayed everything, but there were clearly things that would have never happened in the Attitude Era if Russo wasn't there. Things that all-time legendary. The Survivor Series tournament, 98. The Rock and Sock Connection stories. Seriously, folks. The SEX and TNA, the early TNA days. Brilliance by Vince Russo. Again, Bischoff created the NWO. Brilliant. Turned Hogan heel. Brilliant. So, but he was an asshole businessman. That's the truth. And maybe Russo was a little too creative for his own good. And of course, maybe good old Jimmy Cornette is just too stubborn of a man and holds grudges, right? And wants to piss on graves of people that he grew not to like Vince Russo. But I clearly like Jimmy Cornette. I clearly like Vince Russo. Bischoff, I've said, I probably come across as I dislike him, so I think I'm going to stick with that. I dislike Bischoff. But what he did on camera, cool. I thought it was cool how he portrayed the NWO in those early days. But you shouldn't come at me or other fans because they like something and they maybe put their thought process and their passion and their effort into the good of what they like. And somebody comes at you saying, no, well, you like Russo, but he did this, this, and this. Or how can you call Bischoff an asshole? He beat Raw 83 weeks. Everybody they only want to read and hear what they want to hear. They don't want to say, no, I see where you're coming from. Absolutely. You make sense. I get your opinion. I mean, I don't agree with that necessarily, but I see what you're saying. Everything is with malice. It's either my way or the highway. And it gets so frustrating in this world of wrestling today, in the community of wrestling, that if you give an honest opinion of something, like Becky Lynch, for instance, I think WWE is going to screw it up with her. Why? Because they don't want any one star to become bigger than them anymore, right? John Cena was the last one. You kind of see how they book Roman, how they book Braun Strowman. Heck, Brock's the only one that can get away with it, but he's a mainstream star because he's a former UFC heavyweight champion. I'm just suggesting, I've seen a lot of people, the fans have got behind Daniel Bryan. Yes, he was hurt. CM Punk. And WWE did their best to just make them just even keel. I think the same thing's going to happen with Becky Lynch. Zack Ryder was over with the internet crowd. Huge, right? Look what happened to Zack Ryder. Rusev Day. Look what happened to Rusev Day. Until I see something, a star become a star and actually maintain that bright light, WWE finds ways to diminish it. So when I say that on Twitter, like, I like Becky, but Becky Lynch could become just an average, performer, because they're going to make sure you don't like her too much because it's about the brand, not about one person. And then people are like, oh, you're a Becky hater. No, I said I like Becky. I'm just being honest. I'm just telling you how WWE creative is. So fans on the internet need to lighten up. If somebody likes something you don't, just kind of see why. Or if you're going to come at them why you think differently, do it respectfully. Polarizing figures in wrestling. And it's just funny. I call Eric Bischoff an asshole. And next thing I know, like I said, I have people coming at me, unfriending me, unfollowing me. When you come at me and you instantly discredit, I'm a Russo supporter. I'm a Russo guy. I'm a Vince Russo guy. You discredit that and you go out of your way to basically try to call me dumb for saying that, I'm going to come back at you with some vulgar things myself. I can play that game. I'm not talking about your family, your friends. I'm not talking about you personally. I'm talking about you in general, what you tweet, what you write about online about wrestling. You should be flattered I give you that attention. So it's just funny. I wanted to talk about that because, again, it all stems to the polarizing figures. And I'm sure there's other ones that there's in the history of wrestling, there's been other polarizing figures that I haven't mentioned. But let's face it, Cornette, Russo, and Bischoff, and they all have podcasts today, definitely have stretched their relevancy to 2018 because of what they used to do, how great they were at it. They had the highs and the lows, and it's just funny because the haters only want to talk about the lows. And that's just not fair. That's not, So it is what it is. If you want to continue this discussion, follow me on Twitter at @NoDQ_virtue, and I'd be glad. There are people that come and tweet me, and they'll say it'll be respectful, and they know how I operate on Twitter. It might turn into some banter, but when people automatically just discredit you or call you dumb, you're going to get the Virtue harsh treatment. Sometimes I'll just block you. I'll get my last jab in at you and I'll block you because I know it's never going to lead anywhere because I know what a troll is, right? It takes a troll to be a troll. But the problem is I speak the truth. I've talked to a lot of people in the business. I've been in a Vince Russo writing seminar. I've been on podcasts with Big Vito. I've tweeted with other indie wrestlers. I've been in indie locker rooms. I know how it all works. I have a pretty good grasp of it. The only thing I'm guilty of is I've never worked or got paid for the big time, like WWE. There is no WCW today. I was a kid back then, so I'll never be able to say I have that experience unless I try to go work for WWE. But the fact is, it's ex-soap opera writers they hire now. Remember, there used to be a dozen soap operas on TV. Now there's only 4. Those writers that got their shows canceled, Vince McMahon probably hired them. Maybe that's why the writing's so bad. But just respect people's opinions, right? And if you go strong, if it turns into a name calling war, look why. Maybe you came in a little too heavy and harsh, and that's why the retaliation came back to you. That's all I'm going to say, but we can talk about this stuff forever. And I don't really even want to talk about Survivor Series preview and predictions. You can go catch my No DQ. I'm on the No DQ panel for that. So go over to nodq.com. That's going to be posted in a day or two. But I probably will do my review of Survivor Series. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about the NXT show too, War Games, on next week's Virtue's Brand of Wrestling. So my movie, or should I say movies of the week. See, it's the original 4 Batman movies. The first 2, Batman 1989, Jack Nicholson is a Joker. Batman Returns, right here. These are the 2 Tim Burton films. Phenomenal. My favorite superhero movie of all time is still Batman Returns. I love it. Christopher Walken. It's dark, it's gloomy, it's Tim Burton at its finest. Then I like this one the next best out of these 4. And then I would say, obviously, Forever, the one that had Tommy Lee Jones and Jim Carrey. And then, of course, this one, Batman and Robin, George Clooney, was so bad, it's kind of become funny and good. Like, you just watch it for Uma Thurman. Oh, yeah. Maybe a little bit of Alicia Silverstone. But Schwarzenegger, he's just funny. He's a funny guy. Freeze. You know what I mean? The Iceman has cometh. The movie's bad, but it's so bad it's become good. But these are the original 4 Batman film movies before the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy came out, before all this new Justice League stuff come out. So my favorites are Batman Returns, number 1, Batman 1989, number 2, Batman Forever, number 3, Batman and Robin, number 4, out of these ones. Maybe next time I'll do the Christopher Nolan trilogy, and I'll rank those ones. So yeah, I'm sure everybody's seen these, but if you haven't, watch them in order. The campiness of the late 80s into the mid 90s was fascinating. So that's it. Noelle's probably going to kick my butt because I think I went over 30 minutes this time, and she's the one that's got to edit all this stuff. But for the Big Vito brand and BigVito.com, I am Virtue. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at NoDQ_Virtue. We'll see you next week. We'll talk about Survivor Series fallout and maybe some NXT War Games fallout. See you later, folks.